Inference Plus Story Short number 30, Series B. The quiet whisper of taffeta skirts was the only sound in the room as the ladies tried unsuccessfully to stifle their excitement. The remains of luncheon were being cleared discreetly from the tables, but most of the crustless cucumber sandwiches and rhubarb jam pasties remained untouched. Stomachs were too filled with the butterflies of tumult to accommodate a salmon courgette. There were 4 times during the social season that sparked breathless anticipation among the women of the Myrtleville League of Benevolent Matrons. The Christmas Carolers' Ball, the citywide Memorial Day Picnic and Remembrance, the Independence Day Parade on Main Street, and the Spring Luncheon to elect next year's president of the League. At its inception, the mission of the Myrtleville League of Benevolent Matrons had been to foster a spirit of wholesome and godly service to all the citizens of their fair town, from the lowest of the working class to the creme de la creme of the town's elite. That had been 40 years ago, and in the decades since, the League had experienced the slow and inevitable transformation of so many small-town ladies' groups from a mighty force for good into a gladiatorial fight in which the pocketbooks and fans were wielded with greater vengeance than any sword or trident. And on no day were the hungry fangs of the fighters sharper than on election day. The past few years had been challenging ones for the League. A series of doddering dowagers, better suited to light needlework and leisurely garden constitutionals than the helm of the community's vessel for service, had thrown the group's important work into total disarray, and it was quietly agreed that it was time for a bit of fresh blood to invigorate the organization before the entire body infected with incompetence. No one was advocating disrespect for one's elders, merely encouraging them to manage the smaller but still highly essential committees. Socks for the French orphans had to be knitted, after all, and it was a noble pursuit. And if this ensured that the Coleman's donkey with the nervous stomach wasn't placed in front of the school board at the parade, so much the better. As was tradition, the votes were cast as the women entered the luncheon on tiny paper ballots that were slipped into a wooden box kept especially for this occasion. This year, voting was mostly a formality. Everyone knew that Mrs. Catherine Ward would win. The excitement in the room was primarily a product of the need to wait to announce her secession. Mrs. Ward would do a marvelous job. She had already served on the Young Matrons Committee for 6 years, attended every meeting, and was an efficient note-taker, possessed a diplomatic charm that diffused the catty sniping that so often cropped up among the women, and came from a discreetly moneyed family that understood the importance of humility. Mrs. Ward had the sort of cool head that would never allow a digestively challenged beast of burden to unleash its intestinal ire on Dr. Tompkins and Mrs. Emberberry. There was, of course, another name on the ballot, Mrs. Beatrix Zimmer, but her inclusion was merely a formality. She was a nice enough young lady, but hardly the diligent, hard-working sort. Beatrix attended a meeting here and there, mostly biding her time until the luncheon was served and departing soon after with one of her headaches. A pretty thing, to be sure, but not cut from the same sturdy cloth as Mrs. Catherine Ward. If Catherine was woven of dependable chambray, Beatrix was composed of an insubstantial gauze. In terms of durability and utility, Catherine was the logical choice. To expand upon the metaphor, a donkey can poop right through gauze, and what was needed was containment. And Beatrix wore a lot of purple. Too flashy, distasteful. A faux pas only the newly minted rich would make that brought down the general quality of the entire organization. And the feathers, unspeakable. The ballot counting took an unusually long time, a development most of the women blamed on the doddering dowagers doing the counting. Everything simply took longer when you'd lived for more than 7 decades, and that was a fact of life. When the shuffling of silk slippers and the tapping of canes sounded in the anteroom, a communal sigh of relief passed through the crowd. The additional cups of tea consumed while waiting had resulted in a number of full bladders that cried out to be released. Mrs. Hester Faraday cleared her ancient throat and announced the newest president of the Myrtleville League of Benevolent Matrons, and a combination of smiling murmurs and indignant gasps filled the room right before all hell broke loose.